Okay, so Microsoft has jumped into the reasoning game with the announcement of the Phi-4 reasoning models. In this video, I'm going to go through, have a look at them. We'll have a little play with them in code, see what they can do. And we'll also look at some of the concepts around what we would love to have as a small reasoning model. So first off, jumping into the Microsoft blog post here, they're talking about 1 year of Phi models. It actually seems a lot longer than that to me, but they certainly have iterated a lot since the early Phi models and since the models that sort of preceded them. So remember, the whole idea with this Phi stuff was to basically test out making small models that could be trained with synthetic data, often distilled from a much bigger model like GPT-4, etc. So the main topic of this release is that they're announcing some new Phi models, which are reasoning models. And it looks like they're jumping into the reasoning game, both to reveal some new models, which do kind of look interesting and also kind of a little bit puzzling around how they've decided to make each of the different ones. So we're talking about 3 models here. We've got Phi-4 reasoning, Phi-4 reasoning plus, unfortunately no Phi-4 reasoning max, right? And then the third one we've got is the Phi-4 mini reasoning in here. And certainly this one is probably the one that's most interesting to me, is like, okay, how much can you actually get a reasoning model in something that's really small? Now, if they had released this last week, it probably would have been a lot more interesting to see what we could actually do with a small reasoning model. Unfortunately, they've been sort of beaten to the punch by the Qwen 3 models, which I showed go right down to 0.6 billion for a reasoning model. Anyway, jumping into what Microsoft is releasing here, we can see that they talk about these being leveraged for inference time scaling, to basically predicting out longer chains of thought, etc. Now, they seem to have focused mostly on mathematical reasoning in here. And also interesting to see that really they seem to be focused on distillation here. Now, they talk about using distillation and reinforcement learning. So we'll look at what they've actually done in here. But as I start to go through this, it certainly seems to me that a lot of what they have done here is actually just distilling from much bigger reasoning models to be able to get these smaller models to have similar kinds of chains of thought, etc. So the Phi-4 reasoning is a 14 billion parameter model, so it's not actually that small in the grand scheme of things. It's basically been trained on curated examples from O3 Mini. So this is a form of distillation where they've obviously produced out a lot of different examples from the O3 Mini, not even the O3, which would have been nice to see. And then they've used that as a synthetic data set to actually fine-tune the previous Phi-4 that they already had in here. The Phi-4 Reasoning Plus seems to take that first version, but then add to it with reinforcement learning in here to use about 1.5 times more tokens than just the straight up Phi-4 reasoning by itself. And then the third one that they're releasing is the one, like I said, that I find the kind of most interesting one in here. And this is the Phi-4 Mini. So this one is basically a distillation from DeepSeek. So you could actually even call this one the Phi DeepSeek model, because it looks like they've fine-tuned this with synthetic data generated by the DeepSeek R1 model. And interestingly, in the blog post, they don't actually mention using anything else. So if it really is just everything taken from DeepSeek, then basically this is just the Phi Mini DeepSeek R1. Like we saw DeepSeek release a lot of distilled versions, mostly from Qwen and from some of the other models that they did distillation versions of R1 with. And I would just like to point out, one of the things that frustrated me when DeepSeek came out is that people talked about these distilled versions as if they were the real DeepSeek R1. And you would see people talking about, oh, I'm running DeepSeek R1 on my computer, only to find that they were running a much smaller distilled version, which was both quantized and hugely smaller, just not going to get anywhere near the kind of results out that you would from the real DeepSeek R1 model. And sure enough, this is holding true to that, in that it looks like none of these purely distilled models are doing anywhere near the quality of the top reasoning models that they've actually been distilled from. We see in their benchmarks that they compare to O1 Mini when they used O3 Mini. We can see that they compare to the DeepSeek distilled Llama 8B instead of the full one. While the Phi-4 reasoning model, which is purely distilled, does do a lot better than the old Phi-4 model, it's only the Phi-4 reasoning plus, which adds in the GRPO RL element in there, that actually gets close to the much better quality reasoning models. So let's jump into the paper and find out a little bit more details of what they've actually done in here. Okay, so jumping into the paper, it actually turns out there are two papers. There's one for the Phi-4 reasoning, or the big versions of these, and one for the Phi-4 mini reasoning. So I'm going to concentrate more on the Phi-4 mini reasoning just because I find that really interesting. The first paper reinforces kind of what I was talking about. In many ways, a lot of it is just distilling from the better reasoning models out there. So that includes the O3 Mini, the DeepSeek R1, etc., as well as then they compare to some of the distilled versions of the DeepSeek. The paper and the model that I find much more interesting is the actual Phi-4 mini reasoning one here. So the idea here is that they take that base Phi-4 mini model and they supplement the training of that to get a much better result out. And if you look at the results that they are getting, it's certainly sort of comparable to models of a similar size, or at least sub 10 billion parameter size here. So the fact that this model is actually just 3.8 billion parameters really shows that you can get some of this reasoning qualities into a small model. Now, we already sort of saw that with the Quen models. As I'm recording this, I'm yet to see an actual paper for the Quen models with a full sort of description of what they did. The team behind the Phi models, though, has actually given us some real interesting information in here of what they've actually done. So they've done a number of different things with this base model. A lot of it is sort of, in some ways, continued pre-training of this. So they refer to this as a continual training using a curated chain of thought reasoning data set in here. And the idea is that they start off just continuing the next token prediction, right? So this is not even sort of normal supervised fine tuning or anything, but just getting the model to see longer chains of thought and to start to be able to sort of emulate those, I guess. And it looks like a decent amount of that data set actually comes from the DeepSeek R1. So that's kind of interesting in itself, that Microsoft has kind of gone for that rather than perhaps go for some of the other models that they have access to from OpenAI, etc. So once they've got that first sort of continued pre-training with these chains of thought done, then they move into doing a sort of supervised fine-tuning version of the same things. So then they're getting input and output pairs at this point for this extra supervised fine-tuning. Now, this is on a pretty heavily curated data set here relating to math with a variety of different difficulty levels right up and exceeding college level maths in here. All right, once that's done, they then do their alignment training. So the alignment training is actually being done with DPO. And here they're making use of the outputs in that data set that perhaps weren't correct to align the model to go for correct answers with long chain of thought, as opposed to incorrect answers with long chain of thought in here. Finally, and this point is kind of interesting, the order that they've done these 4 different types of training in here. Finally, they've got the RLVR, or reinforcement learning with verifiable rewards in here. So remember, that's where basically they know what the answer should be. They can then use the reinforcement learning to predict that answer out, penalize the model if it's wrong, reward the model if it's right. And you can see that, interestingly, they use 2 types of RL. So they're using PPO RL, as well as the one that DeepSeek used, which is this GRPO reward sort of system in here. So it is interesting to see that a lot of the results with this model and with this paper really revolve around creating this synthetic chain of thought data set stuff. And I think that's really interesting. As far as I know, those final sort of data sets haven't actually been made public, even though they have used some already public data sets along the way. Okay, so just going back to the blog here, there was another really interesting point that I wanted to sort of show that they talked about in the blog. And this is the whole thing of how they're actually looking at using the Phi models for Windows devices. So I don't use Windows devices. I tend to use Mac or Linux for most things. But it's interesting to see that they're sort of looking at using these models to run locally, both on CPUs and sort of GPUs, and even perhaps their NPU kind of thing, as being a model that's not only really efficient, but they could have a specialized version for doing particular tasks and doing things in Windows and other Microsoft apps, etc. So they talk about this is already being used in Outlook, already being used for perhaps Copilot summary features for offline use, etc. So we know in the past for Copilot, they've tended to use the OpenAI models. You've got to think that maybe this is a way that Microsoft can reduce the reliance on having to use those APIs and try to be able to run certain things locally. And to that extent, they've actually rolled out a special version of Phi called Phi Silica. So this is something that they announced in the past, but it's something that they're actively working on to get these Phi models to actually work better on their local operating system, etc. Now, I think we're going to see this happen from everyone. Apple's been super slow with LLMs, etc. That said, it's kind of funny that they've got MLX, they can run a lot of models locally, and you could imagine that sooner or later we're going to start seeing models being baked into the operating system there. This is something that's going to happen everywhere. So it is interesting to see that, okay, with these Phi-4 models, and in particular the Phi-4 reasoning models, this might be what we can sort of anticipate as the level of quality for these operating system models. All right, let's jump into the code and actually have a play with the models and see what they can do. Okay, so just before I jump into the code, why is it that we actually want a really small reasoning model? So this podcast that Andre Karpathy was part of, he talked about a concept that other people have been talking about as well. And it's this idea of having a small model that can do reasoning on things, but doesn't necessarily have all the facts and figures in it. So it doesn't need to be really big. And it could actually then sort of use RAG or use search to be able to obtain facts and figures, but then be able to reason over them, perhaps from first principles. Take a listen to just a quick section of the recording.
And I do think that the current models are wasting a ton of capacity remembering stuff that doesn't matter. Like they remember SHA hashes, they remember like the ancient...
Because the data set is not curated the best it can
Yeah,
be.
exactly. And I think this will go away. And I think we just need to get to the cognitive core. And I think the cognitive core can be extremely small. And it's just this thing that thinks. And if it needs to look up information, it knows how to use different tools.
Is that like 3 billion parameters? Is that 20 billion parameters?
I think even a billion suffices. We'll probably get to that point. And the models can be very, very small. And I think the reason they can be very small is fundamentally, I think, just like distillation works. It may be like the only thing I would say. Distillation works like surprisingly well. Distillation is where you get a really big model or a huge amount of compute or something like that, supervising a very small model.
So you can see from that recording, the whole idea of having a small model which is really good at reasoning about things, but doesn't necessarily have to have all the facts about things, could be a really core component in something like AGI or even just better quality of LLMs, etc., that we're going for. Now, if we jump in and have a look at the Phi-4 mini reasoning, you can see that this is going to fit nicely on a T4. We can load it up, and we can see from their example that if we start generating, it will generate out the think tokens. So you can see all of this section here is thinking, and then it will basically give us the answer out for its explanation and whatever it's going to give us an answer out for in here. So just quickly going through this, if we look at some of the typical questions I've asked before, you will first get out the reasoning. And it will basically break this down into a set of reasoning elements, and then it will go into the actual solution. So you'll see the end of the think tag, and then you'll actually get into the answer there. Now, it is interesting to sort of look at this and just see, okay, what is the thinking like? it does seem to be much more focused on mathematics when I go through it and look at it, comparing the GSM 8K questions and stuff like that. It does very well. When I ask it more of the sort of traditional questions that I've asked it in the past, you can see that sure enough, it is still able to break down some of the components of the reasoning, but it has a very different feel for me personally compared to the DeepSeek models, compared to the Qwen models. If we look at the Qwen 3 1.7 billion model in here, we can see that the feel of it is quite different in that it's much more sort of like, okay, the user wants to know this. All right, let me start putting it together, as opposed to the sort of feel in the reasoning of where it doesn't really refer to the user in this. It refers to basically what it needs to do and go through this. And my guess is that for different tasks, you're going to see different qualities of reasoning in here. For me personally, I think the Qwen ones are perhaps a little bit better. Also, the model's actually even smaller than this still. But neither of them seems to get to the quality of Gemini 2.5, where it seems to outline step by step, like numbered bullet points of what it's actually doing in the reasoning. And each part of the reasoning seems to come at the problem from a different angle, which I think is really one of the things that I like about that model so much. But anyway, I'll put this notebook up so you can have a play with it yourself. And if you are looking at embedding a reasoning model that's reasonably small and you don't decide to go for the Qwen models, personally, I would say that this is the next best one that's out there at the moment that you could run as a very small model and yet still be able to get a lot of these things out from this. My guess is that people will be able to get these things to play off against each other, having debates with the reasoning and stuff like that to try and strengthen it. That's going to be a whole new sort of area that I think people are going to experiment with and could lead to a lot of interesting things going forward. Anyway, if you've had a play with the model, let me know in the comments what you think about it. How do you feel about the Microsoft models compared to the Qwen models? Like I said, had this model come out a week or 2 weeks earlier, you got to think it would have been received a lot better than the 1 week after following, when Alibaba basically dropped all these different sizes of the Qwen reasoning models. All right, so if you found the video useful, please click like and subscribe, and I will talk to you in the next video. Bye for now.